It begins with the sound of rain. Cold, quiet rain, falling on a forgotten field, a place where no traveler stops and no monument stands. Once, long ago, kings sent men to die here. Once, the clash of iron and the cries of horses shook the sky. Now, there is only the wind and the whisper of grass growing over bones that no one remembers. This is the story of those battles, the wars that changed nothing, the dreams that ended in mud and silence, the forgotten wars of medieval kings. In the Middle Ages, Europe was not a continent of peace. It was a chessboard of thrones, each one trembling, each one hungry. From the coasts of England to the mountains of Bohemia, from the forests of France to the burning plains of Spain, kings quarreled as if the world itself were too small for their pride. But not every war shaped empires. Some began with a whisper of ambition and ended in dust. Some were fought for castles no one needed, for borders no one could draw, for insults no one remembers. These were the battles that changed nothing. In the flickering candlelight of medieval courts, the world was measured not in peace, but in power. A king's worth was weighed by the banners he could summon, the knights he could feed, and the gold he could burn to wage his next holy cause. Some fought for God. Some fought for land. Most fought for themselves. And yet, when the banners came down and the songs of victory faded, the same peasants plowed the same fields, the same lords taxed the same villages, and the same stories repeated in different names. History remembers the Grand Wars, Hastings, Agincourt, Tours, the Crusades. But hidden between those legends lie the quiet wars, small, brutal, and utterly forgotten. It begins in the year of our Lord 1215, when the earth itself seemed restless with kings. England was ruled by a man known in his own time as John Lackland, a king without luck, without friends, and soon without a crown. Across the sea in France, King Philip II dreamed of finishing what his father began, the humbling of England and the shaping of a united French realm. But the story that night would not belong to them alone. It would belong to every small lord, every minor duke, every forgotten prince who raised a banner for reasons that made sense only to them. There was King Otto of the Holy Roman Empire, a man who claimed half of Europe by right and held none of it by strength. There was King Peter of Aragon, who marched to war in defense of papal honor and died in a cause no one understood. And there were the nameless, captains, knights, peasants with sharpened scythes, who followed their kings into fields they could not find on any map. It was said in those days that a battle could begin with a single insult at a royal feast, perhaps a goblet tipped, a word twisted, a claim to some distant cousin's title, and then, as easily as a candle flickers, men were dying for it. In the south of France, there was once such a war, the War of the Three Banners. It began with an argument over whose flag should hang above a castle's gate. Three lords, each with royal blood diluted by generations, each with pride undiluted by sense. Their dispute lasted 15 years. When it ended, 2,000 men were dead, the castle burned, and the land returned to its previous owner, a bishop who never left Rome. Such wars were not rare. They were the rhythm of the age. Men lived, fought, and died without ever knowing why their king had chosen war over peace. Imagine it, a knight sharpening his sword by firelight, hearing only rumors. A peasant taken from his village to march under a banner he cannot read. A king signing a treaty he'll break before the ink dries. All across Europe, small wars bloomed like weeds between the stones of larger empires. Each claimed to defend honor. Each claimed to protect faith. Each, in the end, consumed men for nothing. In England, after the loss of Normandy, King John waged what chroniclers later called the War of Barons. But the truth was simpler. It was a tantrum with swords. When his nobles refused his taxes, he called them traitors. When they refused his wars, he called them cowards. So the barons raised their own armies, and England tore itself apart for 2 years.
Villages burned, monasteries looted, towns turned into graveyards, and when it was over, what had changed? Nothing. John was dead. His son Henry was crowned. The same barons swore fealty to the same crown. The fields were replanted, the castles repaired, and history moved on as if nothing had happened. Far away in Bohemia, a minor feud between two counts, both cousins, over a forest led to the Battle of the Silver Brook. Neither side won. Both armies retreated in snow, frozen and starving, leaving the forest untouched. When spring came, the peasants returned to their fields, and the cousins signed peace, witnessed by no one. Even the chronicler who recorded it left the year blank. Such was the Middle Ages, a world where wars ended not with peace treaties, but with exhaustion. At night kings dreamed of glory. By morning they counted their debts. Battles cost coin, and coin demanded taxes, and taxes demanded obedience. Thus the wheel turned endlessly. The Church blessed and cursed these wars in equal measure. Popes declared holy causes and then revoked them. Bishops sold indulgences to both sides. The words "God wills it" became less a cry of faith and more a slogan of convenience. And through it all, the peasants endured. For them, the color of the flag mattered less than the color of the soil, whether it was red with blood or black with harvest. In the candlelit chambers of kings, advisors whispered of honor and destiny. In the mud of battlefields, men whispered of home. The world spun, and the crown passed from head to head, each promising peace, each bringing another war. That is where this story begins, not with the wars that shaped the world, but with those that left it exactly as they found it. The forgotten wars, the meaningless triumphs, the blood spilled for pride, for symbols, for nothing. For in the end, perhaps the greatest truth of medieval history is this, that even the most powerful kings were prisoners of their own vanity. And sometimes, the most human moments in history are found not in victory, but in futility. And so, our journey begins, across kingdoms and centuries, into the heart of forgotten glory. The first war we visit lies in the cold mountains of Castile, where two brothers once led armies against each other in a storm that would leave nothing but silence behind. The Brothers' War of Castile. The year was 1282. and Spain was still a land divided by faith, ambition, and blood. The Reconquista was slowly reclaiming the peninsula from Muslim rule, yet for every battle against the Moors, there were two fought among Christians themselves. In the mountain realm of Castile, where wind howled through lonely castles and dust clung to the armor of riders, a quarrel began between two brothers, King Sancho and Prince Alfonso. Both sons of the same father, both heirs to the same land, both sworn to the same God. And yet, as the chronicles later said, they drew swords before they shared bread. It started, as such wars often did, with a question of inheritance. Their father, King Alfonso VIII, called El Sabio, the Wise, was a scholar more than a warrior. He loved books, not battles. He wrote laws, charted stars, and dreamed of uniting Spain under a crown of learning. But even the wisest king must name an heir. When Alfonso VIII chose his elder son's child rather than his younger son Sancho, jealousy turned to fury. Sancho felt robbed, not just of a crown, but of his destiny. And destiny, to a medieval prince, was everything. At first, it was only words. Courtiers whispered in the halls of Toledo, nobles picked sides at feasts. Coins were minted with different faces. Then came the banners. Then came the fire. Sancho rode through Castile, claiming divine right, his men shouting, "God chose the strong." Alfonso's loyalists answered from the hill castles, "God chose the rightful."
Soon the land itself seemed to split. Castile became a chessboard of sieges and betrayals. Villages swore fealty one week, rebellion the next. Farmers plowed their fields while soldiers marched across them, both praying the other would vanish by morning. There was no grand battle at first, only small skirmishes, ambushes in forests, sudden raids at dawn. Men killed their cousins, their neighbors, sometimes their own brothers. And through it all, each side believed they fought for justice. The chroniclers, centuries later, would call it La Guerra de los Hermanos, the War of the Brothers. But the peasants who survived simply called it the year the sun forgot us. In a village near Burgos, an old widow named Inés once told a traveling friar what she remembered. "They came in the spring, took our bread, and promised to pay. Then others came, burned the barn, and promised peace. I buried my husband that summer. He never left the farm. He died when they argued over whose flag to hang on the barn door." Her story never made it into the royal archives, but it lived longer than the kings who caused it. By autumn, the war reached its climax in the Battle of Badajoz. It wasn't a grand clash like Poitiers or Hastings, just two tired armies meeting by accident near a dried-up riverbed. Each thought the other was retreating. Each, out of pride, refused to yield. At dawn, the trumpets sounded. Men who had known each other as boys met again, not in greeting, but in slaughter. The battle lasted from morning till dusk. Neither side won. When the moon rose, the ground was so trampled and wet that the horses refused to step forward. corpses lay tangled under banners that no longer mattered. A friar who wandered the field days later wrote, "I could not tell whose were the dead. Brother lay upon brother, and the flies did not ask who was king." In the end, King Sancho seized the throne. His nephew fled, his father died, and the crown of Castile glittered, briefly, on his brow. But the cost? Half his kingdom burned. The nobles hated him. The church excommunicated him. And the peasants who had once called him savior now called him curse.
Within 5 years, famine came. Within 10, plague. Within 20, his dynasty collapsed, and the same nobles who had fought for him now crowned another. Historians call that period a turning point that turned nothing. The borders of Castile stayed the same. The people lived and died under the same taxes. The only things that changed were names and graves. Still, the legend of the brothers' war lingered in whispers. Bards sang of the cursed crown, of the two brothers whose hatred brought eternal night to Castile. In one version, Sancho dreams of his dead brother visiting him, covered in ash, saying, "You have won nothing, brother. You only borrowed the wind." And perhaps in that haunting line lies the truth of all forgotten wars. The medieval world was full of them. When one king died, another rose. When one war ended, another began. But rarely did the earth itself notice. A farmer in France, a monk in Germany, a weaver in Flanders, all would wake the next morning to the same toil, the same hunger, the same prayers. To them, the wars of kings were like distant storms, thunderous, frightening, but always passing. So we leave Castile, where brothers buried their honor and called it victory. Our next story takes us north, into the rain and fog of Scotland, where another war, born of pride and promise, would rage for years and leave nothing but ghosts. The War of the Empty Throne, Scotland's forgotten claim. The wind off the North Sea carried a chill that could cut through armor. In that grey dawn, Scotland waited, not for peace, not for glory, but for a king. The year was 1290, and for the first time in memory, Scotland had no ruler. The old queen, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was dead, a child no older than 7. Her small coffin had barely reached the coast before the nobles began whispering, who would wear the crown now? It was a question that would drown the kingdom in blood. At first, it seemed simple. The Scottish throne, ancient and proud, had no direct heir. But it had claimants, 13 of them, each with family trees longer than their swords. 2 names rose above the rest, John Balliol and Robert Bruce. Both men noble, both of royal blood, both convinced God favored them. But when pride meets ambition, peace never lasts. And so began what the monks of Melrose Abbey called Bellum Vacui Throni, the War of the Empty Throne.
To settle the dispute, the nobles turned, disastrously, to Edward I of England, the so-called Hammer of the Scots. He was meant to act as judge. Instead, he came as master. Edward rode north with banners of England and an army of clerks, soldiers, and lawyers. He claimed he would decide fairly, but before any name was spoken, he demanded the Scottish lords swear loyalty to him. It was a trick wrapped in parchment, and they fell for it. In 1292, Edward declared John Balliol king, a man the Scots soon called Tum Tabard, the empty coat. For though he wore a crown, he ruled under Edward's shadow. Every law, every tax, every judgment, all had to pass through England's hand. It was a throne without power, a kingdom without freedom. At first, Balliol endured it. He smiled, he nodded, he obeyed. But humiliation festers faster than hunger. When Edward demanded Scottish troops for his war against France, Balliol's patience snapped. He tore England's banner from his hall, forged secret alliances with France, and swore Scotland would bow no longer. Thus began the war. The first blow fell on Berwick upon Tweed, Scotland's richest town. Edward's army descended like a storm. They spared no one. When it ended, 10,000 lay dead, merchants, mothers, even monks. Edward's men nailed the Scottish banners to the city gates and left the corpses for the crows. That massacre lit a fire no sword could quench. The Scots rose. Lords who once swore to Edward now broke their oaths. Among them, a name that would echo through history, William Wallace. But in this story, the story of forgotten wars, Wallace is not yet the hero of legend. He is just another rebel, another name on a list of traitors, another man who believed freedom could bloom in blood.
For years, Scotland burned. Villages raided, castles besieged, the land soaked with vengeance. And when the smoke cleared, what had changed? Nothing. Edward still claimed Scotland as his vassal. Balliol was stripped of his crown and imprisoned in the Tower of London. And the people, weary, hungry, leaderless, returned to their ploughs. There were treaties, yes. There were rebellions, yes. There were names carved into stone, Wallace, Bruce, Comyn. But for every battle won, another was lost. For every promise of freedom, another shackle replaced it. Even Robert the Bruce, when he finally took the crown, would spend half his reign hiding in caves, watching his kingdom crumble around him. Chroniclers often wrote of kings and their glory, but the true witnesses were those who had nothing left to write with. In one village near Stirling, a shepherd carved a line into a stone before he fled the English. All kings eat, all men starve. That was Scotland's truth. By the year 1320, after decades of war, famine, and broken oaths, the Scots sent a letter to the Pope, the Declaration of Arbroath. It was not a demand for victory. It was a plea to be left alone. We fight not for glory nor for riches, but for freedom, which no good man gives up but with his life. Beautiful words, yes, but even then the war is continued. Edward II, Edward III, new crowns, same greed. And when finally peace came in 1328, it lasted less than 5 years. Scotland gained independence on paper, but in practice, villages still burned, lords still schemed, and hunger still ruled the land.
The war of the empty throne had begun as a question of who should be king. It ended with no answer at all. Centuries later, Scottish poets would write of that age not as a tragedy, but as a mirror, a time when men fought for crowns made of dust, when kings forgot that land does not belong to them, but to those who live and die upon it.
And in the ruins of forgotten castles, the wind still whispers, not of victory, not of defeat, but of the silence that follows both. So ends the War of the Empty Throne, a war that began with 13 claimants and left a kingdom that belonged to none. Next, we turn east, to the heart of Germany, where another emperor, born of ambition and crushed by pride, would lead the Holy Roman Empire into a war that no one wanted and no one remembered. The Emperor's Shadow, the War of the Iron Crown. In the heart of Europe, the air itself seemed heavy with titles. Princes, dukes, counts, bishops, all called themselves something greater than they were. And above them all sat a man who called himself emperor. His name was Henry VII, crowned ruler of the Holy Roman Empire in the early 1300s. He was a quiet man from Luxembourg, not born to greatness, not bred for conquest. But crowns have a way of whispering in men's ears, and before long the whispers became commands. The empire was not an empire as Rome had been. No marble cities, no single throne, only a patchwork of quarrels. To the north, Saxon lords feuded over rivers. To the south, Italian cities plotted like merchants at a market stall. And everywhere bishops and barons swore loyalty to the emperor while sharpening daggers behind their backs. It was a kingdom made of mirrors, every reflection brighter than the truth. When Henry VII rode south to Italy in 1310, he carried with him a dream to unite Christendom beneath the iron crown of Lombardy. The poet said he rode with angels. The merchant said he rode with debt collectors. Both were right. He entered Milan to cheering crowds and golden banners. But beneath those cheers, old grudges festered. The Guelphs and Ghibellines, rival factions older than memory, saw in Henry not a savior, but a chance to destroy one another.
Within weeks, the city of Brescia rebelled. Within months, Florence armed its walls. Within a year, the emperor who had come to bring peace found himself at war with everyone. The chronicles speak of sieges that lasted seasons, of famine in the camps, of German knights dying under Italian suns. One letter from a soldier near Genoa survives. We came to crown an emperor and found only ghosts. The people hate us, the priests curse us, and every road leads not to Rome, but to another grave. In 1312, Henry finally reached Rome, but the city that once crowned Caesars was divided between rival popes and mercenary armies. The basilica doors were barred. The pope himself hid in Avignon. So Henry was crowned not by God's vicar, but by 2 trembling cardinals in a half-ruined church. When the crown touched his head, the sky was silent. No angels sang, no bells rang. Only the crows above the broken arches gave witness. Still, he believed himself chosen. And belief, in that age, was a weapon sharper than any sword. Henry declared war on King Robert of Naples, accusing him of arrogance and blasphemy. It was a holy war in name, a personal feud in truth. He marched south with dwindling troops, his armor rusting, his treasury empty, the summer heat turning his German steel into chains. At Siena he fell ill. Some say poison, some say fever. His physicians could do nothing. He died, whispering, "Tell them the crown was heavier than I imagined." The campaign ended there. No kingdom was united. No peace was won. The Iron Crown returned to its vault. The princes returned to their quarrels. And the empire, that shimmering dream of unity, remained a map drawn in dust.
A chronicler in Prague wrote, "The emperor descended into Italy as thunder, and departed as a sigh. Men remember the noise, but not the rain." Yet for a brief moment, Henry's death birthed legends. Poets called him the last Roman. Painters showed him ascending to heaven in armor. But the peasants of Lombardy remembered only the burned farms and empty fields. In the marketplace of Pisa, they sold trinkets made from the melted spurs of his knights. Children played at war among the ruins of his camps, and the monks wrote his epitaph in a single line. He sought to rule the world and could not rule the wind. Thus ended the War of the Iron Crown, a crusade without faith, a conquest without victory. It changed nothing. The cities remained at war, the emperors continued to dream, and Europe, divided as ever, learned nothing at all. From the ruins of Italy, our path now turns toward the east, to the fog-drenched valleys of Bohemia, where another crown would set father against son, and faith itself would burn. The War of the Rose Cross, Bohemia's burning faith. The story begins in the cold dawn of 1419, when a priest named Jan Żelewski lifted the communion cup before a restless crowd in Prague. He was no king, no nobleman, but his voice carried farther than any crown's decree. He raised the chalice and shouted, "The blood of Christ belongs to all men."
It was a cry not of peace, but of defiance. And in that instant, Bohemia, a quiet kingdom in the heart of Europe, burst into a war that would outlast the men who began it. The people who followed him called themselves Hussites, after the preacher Jan Hus, who had been burned alive for questioning the Pope's authority. His ashes scattered on the Rhine, his words scattered across the continent. The Hussites believed in a faith stripped of gold and lies, a church without greed, a truth spoken in the tongue of the people. But kings and bishops saw heresy where peasants saw justice. And so, from sermons, the flames of war were lit. King Sigismund, heir to the Holy Roman Empire, called for a crusade, not against infidels or pagans, but against his own subjects. The banners of Christendom rose against Bohemia, their crosses painted on shields, their prayers recited over swords. They came to save the souls of men by spilling their blood. But the Hussites were waiting. They were farmers, miners, craftsmen, men who had never stood in a line of battle. Yet they built war wagons, rolling fortresses armed with hooks, pikes, and crude cannon. Under their leader, Jan Žižka, a one-eyed veteran,
they learned to turn desperation into strategy. At Sudomir, they faced knights in shining armor, men who sneered at peasants with pitchforks. The ground was wet, the fields soft. When the knights charged, their horses sunk into the mud, and the wagons opened fire. The First Crusade ended that day, not in victory for Rome, but in humiliation. Žižka became a legend. Blind in one eye and later in both, he still led his armies by sound, by memory, by faith. They sang psalms as they fought, their hymns rising over the smoke of battle.
When a cannonball struck him blind, he said, "I see clearer than any king." He died in 1424, but his soldiers refused to surrender his body to decay. They flayed his skin, dried it, and stretched it over a drum, so that even in death their general could still lead them into battle. Bohemia burned for 20 years. 5 crusades came, 5 crusades failed. The flower of European chivalry broke upon those wagon walls. Knights prayed before charging, peasants prayed before shooting. The prayers rose together, and God, if he listened, remained silent. By 1434, exhaustion had replaced faith. The Hussites, divided by their own visions of purity, turned on one another. At Lipani, brothers faced brothers. The wagons that once guarded liberty now fired upon themselves. And when the smoke cleared, there were no victors, only the dead, and a silence that felt like betrayal. The war ended with compromise. The church allowed a little reform. The nobles reclaimed their estates, and the peasants returned to the soil. All that blood, all that faith, all that fury, and the world went on unchanged. A monk writing decades later summed it up. The faithful fought the faithful, the pure killed the pure, and all claimed it was God's will. But when the fires died, only the bones remembered the truth. So ended the Hussite Wars, a conflict where conviction burned hotter than crowns, where faith promised heaven but delivered only ashes. It was a war that changed nothing, except to prove that even the holiest causes can drown in their own righteousness. Now let us move west again, to a misty island where kings spoke of honor but traded betrayal like coin. A war that was fought for a throne no one truly owned, where cousins called themselves kings and brothers became enemies. The Cousins' War, the roses of blood and dust. In England, the spring rains of 1455 did not bring renewal. They brought soldiers. They brought fear. They brought cousins wearing different colors, one red, one white, marching beneath banners stitched by mothers who would soon be widows. This was not a war between nations. It was a family argument that devoured a kingdom. The Wars of the Roses. 30 years of shifting crowns, betrayed oaths, and murdered kin. A storm that began in whispers and ended in silence. England in those days was weary. The long war with France had drained its blood and its gold. King Henry VI sat on the throne, gentle, pious, and broken. He dreamed of peace, while his nobles dreamed of power. and behind him stood a woman of fire, Queen Margaret of Anjou, fierce and cunning, a lioness protecting a lamb. Opposite her rose Richard, Duke of York, a man who claimed the crown through blood and destiny. He believed he could rule better than Henry, and perhaps in a colder world he would have. But ambition does not bend to reason. And so, on a May morning near St. Albans, the cousins met beneath banners of red and white.
The battle lasted barely an hour. When it was done, the streets of the little town ran with noble blood, and the age of chivalry lay face down in the mud. For the next 30 years, England tore itself apart. The war was not one great conflict, but 100 smaller betrayals. Men swore loyalty at dawn and switched sides by dusk. Victories were won, only to vanish the next year. The crown changed heads like a borrowed helmet. The people no longer cared who ruled. They just wanted the killing to stop. Among the many who rose and fell, none loomed larger than Richard Neville, the kingmaker. He made and unmade monarchs as if moving pieces on a chessboard. First he crowned Edward IV, a golden young warrior of the House of York. Then he turned against him when power soured into arrogance. He marched under the banner of rebellion, calling upon the name of the very king he once destroyed. But destiny does not forgive indecision. At Barnet, in 1471, the morning fog swallowed the battlefield. Neville's men mistook their own allies for enemies. When the mist lifted, the kingmaker lay dead, his dream of control buried with him. Edward IV ruled for a time, bringing brief peace to the weary land, but death came early to him, and his sons, 2 small princes, became pawns in another man's game. That man was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle, sharp, ambitious, loyal only to himself. He smiled, bowed, and swore to protect them. Then the princes vanished into the Tower of London and were never seen again. Richard took the crown as Richard III, and his name became a shadow over England's history. Some said he was a monster. Others, a misunderstood king trapped by necessity. Whatever the truth, his crown was soaked in blood, and his rule began with a whisper of ghosts. In 1485, a final army landed on English shores. Its leader, Henry Tudor, was a distant claimant, a gambler with destiny. His banner bore the Red Dragon of Wales, and behind it marched men who had lost everything except hope. At Bosworth Field, the cousins met one last time. Richard, defiant, led a desperate charge. He cut through the enemy ranks, crying, "A horse, my kingdom for a horse!" But no horse came. A blade found him in the dust, and with his death the crown rolled into the hands of the Tudors. The war ended. Peace returned, at least on paper. The Tudor rose, red and white entwined, became a symbol of unity. But beneath its petals, England remained scarred, distrustful, and hollow. No one truly won the war. The nobles were gone, their houses ruined, the peasants still starved, and the throne, polished and bright, sat empty of honor. A chronicler in Westminster wrote, "They fought for roses and trampled the garden to dust." Thus ended the Cousins' War, a battle of lineage that left no legacy but ruin. It changed kings, but not the kingdom. It crowned ambition, but buried faith. And when the new dawn came, it looked much like the old one, gray, weary, and unchanged. Now, as Europe exhaled after generations of madness, a new kind of war began to whisper in the East. Not a war for crowns or faith, but for survival itself, against the steppe, the storm, and the shadow of forgotten empires. The crusade that never came, the long silence of the East. By the mid-15th century, the world had changed, but the kings of Europe still dreamed in old colors. They still spoke of holy wars and divine vengeance, even as their swords rusted and their coffers emptied. In 1453, the unthinkable happened. Constantinople, the shining capital of the Christian East, fell to the armies of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II. The cross that had crowned its domes for 1,000 years was torn down, and the crescent rose in its place. Europe gasped. Church bells tolled across kingdoms, and preachers called for vengeance. But the crusade they demanded never came.
So the Holy Land faded, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The age of crusaders ended not in glory, but in apathy. Still, one man dreamed of a final crusade. He was not a king, nor a warrior, but a scholar, Pope Pius II. He was old, tired, and ill, but in his heart burned the last ember of Christendom's crusading fire. He wrote letters to every monarch in Europe. "Come, let us stand together once more against the infidel. The East calls for aid. The tomb of Christ waits for deliverance." The letters went unanswered. France sent excuses. England sent silence. Hungary sent regrets. Even Venice, that city of sails, preferred trade to salvation. So Pius did what no pope had done before him. He decided to lead the crusade himself. In 1464, he gathered a pitiful army at Ancona, a small port on the Adriatic. Old veterans, starving mercenaries, and a few zealous monks stood beneath the tattered banner of the cross. They waited for ships from Venice, the ships that would never come. The Pope fell ill in the summer heat. He watched the sea, waiting for sails that never broke the horizon. He whispered, "God wills it, perhaps no longer." When his body was carried back to Rome, the crusade died with him. The Ottoman Sultan, far away in his marble palace, never even heard of the failed crusade until years later. He smiled, perhaps, at the thought of a world too weary to fight. The Christians of the East became whispers in their own lands. The walls of Constantinople stood tall, but the bells of Hagia Sophia no longer rang. The age of faith-driven kings was over. In its place came the age of silence, of treaties, debts, and careful neutrality. And yet, silence breeds memory. In monasteries from Poland to Spain, monks copied tales of the old crusaders. They painted them in gold and red, heroes on horseback, their swords aflame. But it was only art, a dream of an age that had died before they were born. In a chronicle written by a nameless friar, one line remains:
The sea waited for them, but the sails never came. And so the East was lost,
not to might, but to forgetfulness. So ended the last breath of the Crusades, not in battle, not in defeat, but in disinterest. No songs were written, no banners preserved. Only the wind over the Adriatic remembers the old vow, Deus vult. God wills it. But men no longer did. Yet the centuries would not stay quiet. In the cold north, another kind of war stirred, a battle not of faith or crowns, but of sheer grinding survival. A war fought in snow and silence, where kings starved beside their soldiers and whole armies vanished into frost. The paper wars, faith, fire, and the fractured crown. It began not with a sword or a trumpet, but with a hammer striking wood. In the year 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther walked up to the doors of a church in Wittenberg and nailed a list of complaints to it. 95 sentences, quiet words written in Latin that would set the world on fire. He wasn't calling for war. He was calling for truth. But truth, once spoken, becomes dangerous. For centuries, kings and popes had walked hand in hand, each feeding the other's power. The pope gave crowns their holiness, the kings gave the church its armies. But Luther's hammer cracked that alliance like old glass. He questioned indulgences, denounced corruption, and said that a man's faith was between him and God, not sold at the price of a coin.
It was a simple thought. But simple thoughts can topple empires. Soon the parchment spread across Europe. Printers copied it faster than kings could ban it. Priests whispered Luther's words in taverns. Peasants carried them in their pockets. The church called him a heretic. Rome demanded silence, but silence could no longer be bought. And so the Reformation began, not a war of armies, but a war of ideas, a paper war, a war that burned without fire, until men decided that words were not enough. The first sparks ignited in Germany, where princes saw opportunity beneath the mask of faith. Some sided with Luther out of belief. Others saw a chance to seize church lands, to fill their coffers with holy gold. Faith met greed, and together they marched to war. In 1524, peasants across the countryside rose up, crying, "God is with us!" They carried sickles and wooden spears, believing the new gospel promised them equality. But Luther, horrified by their violence, turned against them, and the princes crushed the revolt, killing tens of thousands. When the smoke cleared, the words of reform still stood, but the dream of justice lay buried in blood. Then came the Schmalkaldic War, a conflict few remember, yet one that shaped the world. Protestant princes formed a league to defend their faith, while the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V raised his armies in the name of the old church. For years Germany bled again. Cities burned, villages emptied, and faith became indistinguishable from politics. In 1547, at the Battle of Mühlberg, Charles triumphed. The Protestant armies fled, their leaders captured. But the victory meant nothing. The beliefs he fought to crush only spread faster. He could conquer cities, but not hearts.
By the time he abdicated, the empire was more divided than when he began, and yet the paper war refused to die. It spread north to Scandinavia, west to England, south to France, turning brother against brother, king against subject, and altar against altar. In one generation, Europe forgot how to pray together. A single faith had shattered into 1,000 pieces, each claiming to be the truth. A chronicler from Vienna wrote, "They burned books, then men, then cities, and when the ashes settled, they found only more reasons to burn." The Reformation was no crusade, no conquest. It changed every kingdom and yet left the human heart the same, still greedy, still fearful, still searching for certainty in the noise of belief. It ended with treaties signed in blood and ink, with kings declaring new faiths for old reasons, and peasants kneeling to the same hunger under different names of God. It was a victory of the word and a defeat of understanding. The paper war had burned away the world of the Middle Ages. In its place stood something new, a Europe weary of holiness and ready for the cold logic of power.
The Iron Crown returns. The kings who dreamed in smoke. The year was 1618, and Europe was a cauldron ready to boil over. The last embers of the Reformation still glowed, smoldering beneath treaties and false peace. But in the kingdom of Bohemia, those embers were about to burst into flame. It began, as many medieval tragedies do, in a castle. On a gray morning in Prague, Protestant nobles stormed into the royal palace. They accused the emperor's men of violating their rights, and in a sudden fury, they seized them by the collar, dragged them to a high window, and threw them into the moat below. This would be remembered as the defenestration of Prague, a strange word for a simple act. Men thrown from windows, faith thrown into fire. The officials survived the fall by landing, some say, on a pile of manure. But their survival mattered little. The world had just witnessed the first act of what would become the 30 Years' War. It began as a religious quarrel, but it would grow into a nightmare that consumed a continent. What started as Protestants versus Catholics soon became nations versus nations, ambitions against ambitions, until faith was just the excuse and power the only prayer. Armies marched across Germany. Swedes, French, Spaniards, Austrians, each calling their cause holy, each leaving behind a trail of ashes. Crops were trampled, villages burned, and famine rode behind every army. Disease followed famine, and death followed all. The generals who led these wars were men of brilliance and madness. There was Wallenstein, the mercenary prince, who sold his loyalty to the highest bidder, building an army from nothing but promises of plunder. He lived like a king, fought like a god, and died by the blade of his own men, murdered in his sleep by order of the emperor he served. Then came Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, called the Lion of the North. He rode into battle in shining armor, his war a crusade of faith and flame. Under his banner the Protestants rose again. His army fought with discipline, precision, and prayer. At Lutzen, in 1632, he led his men through the fog, charging straight into the enemy's fire. His horse was shot, his sword lost, and the lion fell on the battlefield he had vowed to redeem.
The Swedes mourned, Europe wept, and still the war went on. By its end, in 1648, a third of Germany lay dead. Entire regions were ghost lands, their churches silent, their fields overgrown. At the Peace of Westphalia, kings and envoys gathered to make sense of the ruin. They spoke of borders, sovereignty, and divine rights, words that sounded wise, but meant little to the millions who had died. The map of Europe was redrawn, power shifted, but the lessons of war were lost in the ink of diplomacy. For 30 years they had fought, and in the end, nothing changed that mattered. The peasants still tilled the soil for their lords, the nobles still feasted, and the kings, those survivors of endless battles, still dreamed of empires that would never come. From the dust of the 30 Years' War rose a new kind of ruler, not born of faith or divine mission, but of cold calculation. They no longer asked what God wanted, they asked what worked. In France, one such man was Cardinal Richelieu, the crimson shadow behind the throne of King Louis XIII. He wore a cross, but he thought like a general. He thought not for religion, but for France. Richelieu turned France into the most feared kingdom in Europe, a nation where the crown ruled with steel and silence. He broke noble rebellions, crushed rivals, and built a state that would outlast its kings. Under his guidance, France learned a new language, that of reason, bureaucracy, and control. It was no longer the age of faith, it was the age of the state. And out of this age would come a son, a man who called himself the Sun King. But not all thrones survived the change. In England, a different storm brewed, one between crown and parliament, between divine right and the voice of the people. King Charles I believed his crown was sacred. Parliament disagreed. And so, once again, war came. This time not between nations, but within one. At Naseby, at Edgehill, and finally in London, the Royalists were defeated. Charles was captured, tried by his own subjects, and led to the scaffold. He looked at the crowd before him and said softly, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown." Then the axe fell, and the age of divine kingship shattered in two. But as always, history turns full circle. The man who replaced the king, Oliver Cromwell, ruled with a hand no gentler, no wiser, no freer. The republic he promised became another throne, this one without a crown. When he died, England, tired of experiments, brought back the monarchy. The circle was complete. The wars had changed everything and nothing. In these wars of crowns and causes, we find the same truth repeated, that power, once gained, never rests. It shifts, it mutates, it survives the bodies of kings and the dreams of men. Each conflict leaves behind not victory, but vacuum. And in that emptiness, new ambitions grow. The fires that burned through Europe in the 1600s were not the end of medieval warfare, but the birth of something colder, sharper, the machinery of modern empire.
They called them empires, but in truth they were dreams made of smoke, fragile, beautiful, deadly. Europe's kings no longer fought over God, they fought over maps, lines drawn in ink that would decide who owned oceans, islands, and continents they had never seen. The wars of this new era were not waged in fields of mud, but across the entire world. A soldier might die in India for a cause whispered in London, or a sailor drown near Havana for a treaty signed in Paris. The world had become a chessboard, and every king believed himself the player, never realizing he was only a piece.
Do ye, my God, remember Baruch incorporated my male line mishers? He told me he was. Sheepishly bowing my head to comfort the shooting stars so long from now, my clean starting face as bloody as ever.
India, Africa, the Caribbean. England had found a new battlefield, the world itself. The 18th century became an age of endless wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, each conflict a tangle of alliances, each claiming to preserve balance while tipping the scales further into chaos. They called them Great Wars. But to the farmers who starved, the sailors who drowned, the colonists who burned, there was nothing great about them. One of those forgotten wars, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, would later be called the First True World War. It was fought on 5 continents. It changed everything, and, as always, nothing. In Europe, armies clashed in the snow of Saxony and the forests of Silesia. In North America, they fought among the rivers and trees, redcoats and bluecoats, muskets and drums echoing through virgin lands. And in India, European generals used native soldiers as pawns in their imperial games, turning kingdoms into colonies. When it ended, Britain had won. France had lost Canada, India, and its dreams of empire. The map had shifted. The sun seemed to rise over London. But beneath the victory, new fires smoldered. France would never forget the humiliation, and Britain, drunk on triumph, would soon lose something far more precious than it gained. Across the Atlantic, the colonies Britain had built began to murmur with discontent. They had fought and died for the empire, yet they were treated as servants of it. They were taxed without voice, ruled without choice. In Boston, Philadelphia, and Virginia, men began to whisper dangerous words: liberty, independence, equality. They spoke not as rebels, but as dreamers tired of crowns. And so, in 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution rang out. It was not just a war for a nation, it was a war for an idea. For the first time, the throne was challenged not by another throne, but by the people themselves. Kings watched in disbelief as farmers and printers declared that all men were created equal. It sounded like madness, and yet that madness worked. By 1783, the British Empire had lost its greatest jewel. A new nation stood where colonies once kneeled, and the echo of that rebellion would shake the world. Across the ocean, in France, the people were starving while their king threw banquets in candlelit halls. The wars of empire had drained the treasury. The glory of Versailles had turned to debt. And so, in 1789, the French people rose. At first, they called for reform, then for justice, then for blood. The French Revolution devoured its kings, its priests, and eventually itself.
Out of its ashes would rise a man who called himself the heir of destiny, Napoleon Bonaparte. He would promise peace and bring only war. He would speak of liberty and rule as an emperor. He would conquer Europe in the name of reason and leave it in ruins. Napoleon was the last echo of medieval kingship, a soldier born too late for chivalry and too early for mercy. He crowned himself with his own hands, and for a moment the world truly believed in him. But as we know from another tale, even emperors who dream of glory must someday wake. By the time Napoleon fell, Europe had been at war for over a century. From the battlefields of Marlborough to the thunder of Waterloo, millions had died. And yet, the borders were not so different. The names of the kings had changed, but the world they ruled was the same. The wars had given birth to new nations, new ideas, and new tyrannies. But the lesson, the deep, quiet truth beneath it all, remained unchanged. That every battle for glory is a battle that changes nothing. From the knights of the Middle Ages to the generals of empire, the story has always been the same. Men dream of order, they chase immortality, and the world, patient and unchanging, waits for them to fade. The crowns turn to dust, the banners rot, and the earth swallows them all. But still, the drums of history never stop. They grow quieter, then louder again, as each new age finds its reason to fight. The Last Crown. Reflections in the ashes of glory. The night is quiet now. The drums have stopped. The banners, once bright with lions, crosses, and suns, hang limp in forgotten halls. History, that tireless storyteller, has turned its last page on the Age of Kings. Yet, if you listen closely, beneath the silence, you can still hear it, the faint clatter of hooves, the sigh of steel, the whisper of men who believed they could shape eternity. From the dawn of the Middle Ages to the twilight of Napoleon, the story has never truly changed. It began with faith, grew on ambition, and ended in ash. The kings who fought, Edward, Philip, Henry, Charles, Gustavus, Louis, each believed the next war would be the last, the final strike that would carve order into chaos. But history is not carved, it flows, and every sword that claimed to bring peace only sharpened the next one. The forgotten wars, those tiny sparks between the famous flames, were where humanity's truest story unfolded, not in the grand victories, but in the quiet defeats, in the nameless villages burned and rebuilt, in the peasants who buried their sons and went back to the plow, in the soldiers who fought without knowing why. They did not die for maps or glory. They died because men above them believed that crowns were worth the blood beneath them. Think of the Battle of Crécy, where English archers broke the charge of French knights, and yet nothing changed. Think of Agincourt, where muddy fields swallowed heroes, and yet nothing changed. Think of Pavia, Lutzen, Blenheim, Waterloo, and you will see the same pattern. Victory purchased at ruin's price, followed by peace so fragile
It could not last a generation. The names shift, the banners change, but the silence after battle is always the same. If there is a single truth buried beneath these 1,000 years of struggle, it is this: no war ever ends. It merely sleeps, in treaties, in borders, in memory, until another generation wakes it. The battles that changed nothing are only forgotten because they were never truly over. Their echoes became the foundations of new empires, their lessons ignored until they returned in different uniforms under different flags. History does not repeat, it persists. Imagine for a moment a single sword, forged in the fires of the early Middle Ages. Perhaps it belonged to a Norman knight at Hastings. Perhaps it was taken by a crusader to Jerusalem. Perhaps it rusted on a battlefield in France, then melted down and recast centuries later into the barrel of a cannon at Waterloo. Iron remembers. It changes shape, but never purpose. That sword, like history itself, was born to divide, to draw lines, to claim, to end. And yet, for all its centuries of service, what has it truly won? No sword has ever brought peace, only silence. In the ruins of old Europe, the castles crumble, their stones devoured by moss. Once they were fortresses, now they are graves of ambition.
The fields where knights charged are pastures for cattle. The moats are dry. The kings sleep beneath marble effigies, hands folded, eyes closed, dreaming, perhaps, that their wars still mattered. But if you walk there at dusk, you will see children playing among the stones. They laugh where once men screamed. They build sandcastles where real ones fell. And in that laughter lies something greater than all empires: forgetting. Forgetting is the mercy of history. It is how we move on. It is how pain softens into story. The wars of the medieval kings, those grand, futile struggles for glory, now exist only as echoes, names carved on weathered monuments, lines in books read by candlelight, whispers told by tired historians and dreamers. But beneath those echoes there remains a quiet beauty, the persistence of life, the resilience of the ordinary. No matter how many crowns fell, the world went on. The rivers flowed, the seasons turned, and somewhere a child was born who would never know the sound of war. Perhaps that is the true victory, not of kings, but of time. Time, the only emperor who rules forever. It outlasts every ambition. It turns soldiers to dust and crowns to relics. It humbles the proud, forgives the foolish, and erases the lines men died to defend. In the end, all wars change nothing, because time changes everything. And so the story closes, not with a battle, but with a breath. The torch of history dims, the echoes fade, and the last crown, tarnished and forgotten, rests quietly beneath the earth. It once belonged to a king who dreamed of glory. Now it belongs to no one, and in that it finally finds peace. The wind moves softly through the grass. Somewhere a church bell rings, its sound stretching across centuries.
gentle, hollow, infinite. It rings not for victory, nor for loss, but simply because it must. Because even in silence, history remembers how to speak. And that is how it ends. The wars, the kings, the dreams, the dust. All of it, just stories now. Stories to be told before sleep. For as long as someone remembers them, they will never truly die. But as long as we understand them, perhaps someday we will stop repeating them.